Hello, my name is Betty Siegel, and I'm the Director of the Office of VSA and Accessibility at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. I am a white woman with short black hair and a wavy white streak of hair across the front. I have red glasses and am wearing white jewelry and a bright blue top. To begin this presentation, I am so excited to be here, and I am so excited to be asked to talk about the establishment of accessibility policies and practices at the institutional level. I congratulate and thank the Korean Disability Arts and Culture Center and all of you for the leadership you are demonstrating by participating today. And I hope that what I have to say will support your efforts to create a future that is sustainable and accessible for people with disabilities across Korea. So let's get started. Let me first introduce you to the Kennedy Center. The Kennedy Center is a vibrant cultural hub presenting world-class performances and artists that is accessible to all. At the Office of Access and VSA, we strive to make experiences, performances, and facilities accessible to people with disabilities of all ages and create opportunities for people with disabilities to participate in, engage with the arts and culture. So that's the Kennedy Center, and that's the Office of VSA where I work. Now, to get started on the topic of policies and procedures and inclusion of people with disabilities at an institutional level, let's talk about the thing that most people forget, which is that in order for to build a really solid foundation of accessibility and inclusion at an institution, you have to think about your planning of that accessibility as an ongoing cycle of actions and steps that you are going to take. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see that you want to start with your organizational commitment. We then engage with our community. We want to conduct and assess and audit our accessibility. We then move on to establishing policies, procedures, and practices. And then we engage in a very intensive staff training. We communicate the level of accessibility and information to our guests and audiences so that they can have the opportunity to decide whether they want to participate or not. The point here is that we want to communicate with good information so they can make informed choices about how they engage with the art that you present. We then, as a last step, want to go back through the entire cycle of planning, evaluate and assess and update what we do because things change over time. And if we just become static and dependent on what we've done in the past, we aren't moving forward into the future with new and engaging ways to engage with our audiences. So this cycle of planning starts with the organizational commitment and continues around until we end up back at the beginning where we are once again engaging with our community, assessing and auditing, reassessing our policies, procedures, retraining our staff, and then communicating more with our audiences, visitors, and community. Now, to start with, we want to have an organizational commitment. This is really critical. The organizational commitment is where you identify fundamental principles of accessibility and inclusion. Now, these are the and fundamental principles of your organization. What are your organization's values? These are the foundation of the organization's mission and vision, beliefs, and actions. You want to articulate those and then think about how the larger goals of the institution relate back to your commitment to accessibility. And if possible, you want to go from the organizational large picture institutional structure down to the accessibility structure, where you can summarize your commitment to the disability community in a one or two sentences. So, for example, at the Kennedy Center, we take our values as a cultural institution and our value for the arts being for everyone, and our accessibility commitment is that we will welcome people with disabilities of all ages to engage in all aspects of the work that we do at the Kennedy Center. One sentence, commitment to accessibility. That's where you're going to start, because that organizational commitment is going to drive all of the decisions that you're going to make as you approach access and inclusion. Now, a real technical part of the organizational commitment is to think about how you're going to organize your accessibility processes and how you're going to distribute the responsibilities for accessibility across the institution. And basically in the United States, what I've found is most organizations use one of these four structures on the right-hand side of the screen in order to organize how they approach accessibility at a very technical and strategic structural level. For example, some organizations address accessibility via committee. The committee is made up of representatives from various departments and areas of the institution. So you want to have someone who's from your facilities side. You want to have someone from the administration side, perhaps from your education division. Your artistic programming should be involved in this committee for accessibility. And you convene that committee at a schedule that works for you. And they address all the accessibility issues as a group, as a collective. Another way to approach it is what we would call a centralized approach. Actually, let's go diagonally down on the screen. There's a centralized approach. You have a committee approach and you have a centralized approach. This is where instead of working by committee, you designate an office or a team or a staff member to kind of take sole responsibility for accessibility for across the entire institution. And that centralized office or centralized approach means that you have one team or one individual who's really looking across the entire institution in order to establish the policies and the training and the marketing and the budgeting. Now, as a part of what they do, they need to engage with other departments and divisions across the institution. So when I say solely responsible, that's really not quite true. They are kind of the leader of accessibility, and they convene the rest of the institution around their work. The other way of doing this is centralized with representation. So you have a sort of a centralized focus for who's going to take responsibility for accessibility, but that person really does work with all the different elements of the institution in order to make access happen. And then you have a decentralized approach. This one is frequently used by colleges and universities in the United States, where every division and department in the large institution takes responsibility for accessibility that falls into their area. So, for example, the facilities department would take responsibility for all the physical access issues. Human resources takes care of all the employment issues of accessibility. The artistic programmers or administration take responsibility for all of the programming decisions that have to do with accessibility. None of these is the right or the wrong approach to accessibility. They're just different. And your institution should think about which one of these structures works best for you. So, for example, I know that I have colleagues in museums who frequently use centralized with representation as the way that they approach accessibility, because then they have someone who's kind of looking at everything, but each division or entity within the institution has representation in the process. The Kennedy Center actually uses the centralized office approach. That's my office, the Office of Access and VSA, because we're such a large institution and we're so complex that if one division is off doing one thing, they may not have talked to the other division, and then there's a conflict in accessibility. This decision made over here conflicts with the process or procedure of a division over here. So the centralized office is bringing together all the elements of accessibility under one umbrella, and then we're pushing it back out throughout the institution. So again, this is just a step in your planning process to kind of think about what structure internally are we going to use to ensure that accessibility is carried out globally across the institution as a whole. Another step in the planning process is to engage with your community. I suggest that you start this from the beginning, and it is an ongoing commitment to community engagement. Identify and consult with people with disabilities as advisors and as community and user experts, and embed them in the process from the start, and then continue to engage with them on an ongoing basis. They don't come in and just look at what you're doing. You want them being a part of the process as you're planning and a part of the process as you're applying accessibility. The third step in planning is to conduct and assess, to conduct an audit and assess the level of accessibility that you have. Now, a lot of people are kind of afraid of this step because they're thinking, oh, we're going to do this audit. We're going to identify everything that's wrong. No, an audit like this, conducting an assessment of all your facilities, programs, policies, and practices, is to establish a baseline of all the things that you do right and all the things that need improvements. So you kind of have two columns, right? Your assets, which are the things you do right, and then your debits, those things you have to work on to improve. So for example, at the Kennedy Center, in my asset column, as I conduct my audit of my entire institution, I'm going to put down that we do staff training on a regular basis. That's something we do, and I'm going to note that we do that and how often we do it and how many people we reach. In my debit column, I might say, well, we've got some wheelchair accessible lifts that are old and they're going to need to be replaced. And so I'm going to put those in my debit column. So I'm constantly running things I do right and things that need improvements. And I identify those by conducting a thorough assessment and audit of everything that we do. You establish that baseline in order to create an accessibility plan. Your accessibility plan is going to identify the actions you're going to address in order to improve those areas that need improvements. You're going to identify things like what are the costs associated with those improvements, what's the timeline, what steps need to be taken. The actions can be broken down into steps, and who's going to be responsible for ensuring that those things move forward. Once you have that list of things we do really, really well and things that we need improvement doing, you're going to look at the column that needs improvement and you're going to start to prioritize those things. If you just start at the top and start working your way down a list, you're not going to invest your resources, your time in a way that allows you to really maximize and leverage your time and efforts in accessibility. So prioritizing the actions you're going to take is really a critical step in coming up with a really executable accessibility plan. So don't forget to prioritize things. So for example, on my list, I might say that I do want to replace those wheelchair lifts at some point, but they go to areas that are really not used very frequently by the public. And so I might set them as a slightly lower priority to making sure that my front door, which everybody uses, public, staff, artists, is accessible. And so I might say, well, the front door is a higher priority than the wheelchair lifts. And I'm going to go through all of my column of things that need improvement and make a plan that allows me to address them in an order that makes sense. Your community and those disability advisors are critical in that process of setting those priorities. Please engage them in that. They will help you figure out what needs to happen first and what is less important to them. So after you've conducted your assessments, you've got your audit done, you've got a good idea and a global picture of where your institution's strengths are, those things that are your assets. I have training that goes on a regular basis. My front door is accessible. I have policies that are written down. Those are all in my assets column. And then you have your improvements column, so you have a good picture of where you're going, a roadmap for where you're going to go. And then, only then, after you have a good solid plan in place, do you move forward to establish policies, procedures, and practices for ensuring that your institution is accessible and inclusive of all people of all ages with disabilities. So what are your policies, procedures, and practices? Well, policies are the big picture. They're like your mission vision statement. The policy could very well be your organizational commitment. So the Kennedy Center's policy, the really biggest picture, is that we welcome people with disabilities of all ages to all activities and events of the institution. That's our big picture. The procedures are the planned actions by which our policy, we welcome people with disabilities, are implemented. What do we do to make sure that we are implementing our policy? What are the procedures, the steps, and the actions that we're taking? Now, the practices are the routine ways in which policies and procedures are carried out on a day-to-day basis. Usually what happens for cultural institutions is they're really good at identifying what their policy is, the big picture. And they're pretty good at establishing the planned actions by which they're going to proceed with including accessibility. Where we find that things tend to break down is in the practice of applying our policies and our procedures to real life. What's happening, boots on the ground, day-to-day basis. So for example, I point out the image on the right. And by the way, I should say that all of the images that I show are pictures of people and activities that the Kennedy Center engages with on a regular basis. In this slide, the picture on the right-hand side shows a young woman in a wheelchair. She's one of our artists. We were doing some visits to some VIPs in the Washington, D.C. area, and she was because she had chosen to advocate for herself. And so she was meeting with some of our senators and our congressmen to talk about accessibility and how it affected her as an artist with a disability. We walked in front of this building and we saw that there was this historic center and there was an entrance. There's a clear sign behind her showing arrows going up a step. And that was how you were to enter the building. And then on the left-hand side, there's a sign that says, "This lift is temporarily out of order. We apologize for the inconvenience." So the accessible entrance, which is to the left of her wheelchair, was out of order. So their policy was good, right? They're going to get people into their building. Their procedures were to install a wheelchair lift and make sure that there was a sign that said that the accessible entrance was over here. But they failed in practice because in practice, the lift is broken and they haven't fixed it. And so she can't participate. So this is just one example of what it means to do really well with having your policies in place, to really have your planned actions in order, but then on the day of when it's critical in practice, there's been a breakdown and now she's unable to participate. So policies, procedures, and practices, you have to look at all three. One of the other critical things that you have to do as you move forward after you've established your policies, procedures, and practices, and let me add one additional step in establishing policies, procedures, and practices. It is extremely important for you to write your policies and your procedures and your practices down. Write them down because you use those to train your staff and you use those to be consistent in how you're applying your actions for accessibility so that when people on staff leave, their knowledge doesn't leave with them. You don't have a policy and procedure in place and then a critical staff member leaves and nobody knows what those policies and procedures are. If you have them written down, then you can replace that staff person. The next person reviews all those policies, practices, and procedures, and they can then apply them. So critical step in policies, practices, in the creation of policies, procedures, and practices is to write it down and then to train your staff on those so that everybody is applying the accessibility framework on a consistent basis. Training. Sometimes I think that if we don't do anything else and we just train our staff, we will be so much better at applying accessibility in our cultural institutions. So starting on day one, from the moment you have somebody on staff, you want to train them on accessibility policies, procedures, and practices. You want to train everyone. I mean, from top leadership to the person who's cleaning the floors at night. Everyone should be trained on how to integrate accessibility into everyday practices. At the Kennedy Center, my office sends a representative to every single new staff training event, and those happen every other week. We go to those trainings where new staff are being oriented to the building, they're being given their badges, they're being told what their passwords are to get onto email, and they're being trained on how to get around the building. And then in comes accessibility, and we talk to them about their role and how critical each and every person is to making accessibility work at the Kennedy Center. And we train them on day one, and then we have regular training that takes place annually and sometimes more frequently than annually. Training is meant to empower everyone to make accessibility a priority. So we focus on what their role is and what they can do to ensure that accessibility is rolled out across the entire institution, and that everyone is confident that they have the capacity to welcome people with disabilities to the center. So, for example, here's something that we train people on. The Kennedy Center welcomes people with disabilities. Remember, that's our policy. That's our accessibility commitment. Accessibility, inclusion, and equity are at the core of the center's mission, visions, and values. So we want to make sure that staff understands that this is not something that they can opt to do or opt not to do. It is a part of our values as an institution. These are fundamental principles: that we value our audiences, visitors, staff, volunteers, and performances, that we recognize diversity of need within the disability community, meaning one size does not fit all. We have to look at the variation of abilities that people are bringing into our spaces and to participate in our programs. We incorporate access into day-to-day operations, and we focus on customer service and engagement with the community of people with disabilities, not just for them. So this is what I mean. These are the kinds of things that we train our staff on so that they are empowered to execute accessibility in their different positions and roles on staff. We also train people to treat all people with respect and dignity. This is a piece of accessibility that is absolutely critical. Treat people with disabilities with respect and dignity. Be kind and courteous. Say, "How may I help you?" Don't make assumptions about what a person wants or needs. Just because you see someone with a white cane, for example, you might go, "Oh, they're blind. I'm assuming they're blind. And oh, if they're blind, I assume they need my help." That's an assumption. Maybe they need your help. Maybe they don't. You need to approach them. You introduce yourself. "Hi, my name's Betty. I work here at the Kennedy Center. May I help you?" Now I wait to hear what they tell me, what they need. And they may say, "No, I don't need any help." And I say, "Okay, well, if you do, I'm right over here and I'd be glad to assist you as needed." And if they say, "Yes, actually, I'm trying to find the box office," and I say, "Oh, I'd be happy to show you where the box office is. Would you like me to be your sighted guide today, or would you like me just to walk with you over to the box office?" Treating people with dignity and respect, being kind and courteous. Don't make assumptions. These are core to how we welcome people with disabilities to our institutions. Now, another part of accessibility that people tend to forget and that we need to plan for and be sure that we're checking our plans, our procedures, and practices is the social aspects of the experience of being a part of a cultural experience. There are social aspects, and these social aspects should be equally enjoyed by individuals with diverse abilities. So when we're looking at how we're providing accessibility, we want to look at whether or not we are also taking into account and factoring the social aspects of the experience. So for example, when you come to an entrance, to a building and there's a sign that says enter here, and then there's another sign that says accessibility that way, one group of people is being sent one direction, one group of people is being sent another. Now, this may be unavoidable. It depends on the physical structure of the building. But if it is at all possible to send everybody the same route, we are making sure that as they're approaching this really exciting theatrical or artistic experience, that as a group, they're being able to talk and chat together. They're talking about what they're going to experience. They're talking about how they arrived. That social aspect is really critical. When we split groups up, we send one way and we send another, we're diminishing their opportunity to have that social experience, okay? So think about that as you're doing your planning and you're establishing your accessibility policies, procedures, and practices. Where possible, you want to make sure that those social experiences are equally enjoyed by individuals with diverse abilities. What this all boils down to is that as we are training our staff and doing our planning and preparing for accessibility, we really want to establish as a baseline that we are going to expect differences and we're going to embrace disability as being part of the human condition. That this is not something that about those people over there, that accessibility is about us right here. And that when we make things accessible for us, we are including everyone in our definition of us. So with that, I want to wrap up by leaving you with some resources that you can look into. At the top of this resource list, I have two assessment tools that have been developed by two different organizations. Open Door Arts has a brand new assessment tool, which you can reach at the website that I've identified here online, artsaccessresources.org. And there's another really excellent accessibility assessment toolkit that's been put out by the National Disability Authority in Ireland. There are universal design resources that I think we can leverage to design not only better physical space and better physical experiences, but also design our programs. And then in the United States, we have the Smithsonian Institute that has great resources online, one of which is a guideline for accessible exhibition design. And the Kennedy Center also has some amazing resources that you're welcome to partake in. That's what I have to offer you today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can engage in a little bit of questions and answers. That's a great question. At the Kennedy Center, the Office of Access and VSA acts as the experts in the field of accessibility across the institution. In a way, you can think about us as being an internal consultant on access. So for example, if we have a program area that is inviting an artist with a disability to perform, for example, our jazz program this past year invited 3 incredible blind jazz musicians to perform. And they came to us and said, we're doing this performance. We've invited these musicians. Can you help us figure out what we can do to make sure that their experience as artists at the Kennedy Center is a really positive one? So we work with them throughout their process to identify the types of accommodations that those artists might need, such as they might need Braille information. They might need us to send them audio information. They may need someone to escort them from their dressing rooms to the stage. We might call the artist and say, hi, we're with the Access Office. We'll make sure that when you come here to the Kennedy Center, we are meeting your needs. So how can we support you, artist? So think about us as being that internal, in-house consulting group that works across all of the divisions at the Kennedy Center to ensure that access is applied equitably. That's a really interesting question. In the United States, we have several federal laws, one of which requires us, if we receive federal financial assistance, so if we receive any support from the federal government, we are required to have someone on our staff that's has the title of accessibility coordinator. So usually that person supports the rest of the institution in making things accessible. Even if you're not obligated by law, we strongly recommend across the field of accessibility to designate at least one person to handle accessibility or to help the institution to implement accessibility across all the programming that they do. The advantage of having someone on staff versus a contractor who's temporarily there is that that on staff person knows what happened last time, and they can carry forward and be consistent in the application of accessibility. They can learn from mistakes that happen and correct those moving forward. When you have someone who just comes in for that one event or activity, their expertise and knowledge walks out the door with them. And then the next time you have to start from scratch. So having an accessibility manager or someone on staff who's designated to keep an eye on and implement accessibility can lead to a better experience for everyone because there's consistency and improvements that are constantly happening. At the Kennedy Center, that's what we do in the Office of Accessibility. We are there to make sure that everyone knows what's going on. We are there to support services like sign language interpreters and captioning and audio description. And it is our policies that are being implemented across the institution to ensure that ticketing is fair and equitable, that staff is being trained. So I think it's really important to have that designated person on staff. In the United States, some institutions have that person designated and empower that position. So the other part of it is to empower that person to do the work of access. That's what we do at the Kennedy Center. As I said in the presentation, yes, we spend a lot of time training our staff members to improve accessibility within our organization. But additionally, the Kennedy Center does offer training to other organizations and other cultural institutions. We do that on a case-by-case basis. Usually someone will approach us and ask us if we can train. And in that case, what I'd like to do is talk to them about a train the trainer model. In other words, we come in not to train your front of house staff, but to train the managers and supervisors of the front of house staff so that they can then train their staff. So train the trainer models for other organizations is something that we will do if asked. But we also offer the LEAD Conference, which is an annual convening of accessibility professionals in cultural spaces. So these are theaters and museums who come together and they share information with one another about current accessibility practices. And that's how we focus on developing accessibility professionals, is we make sure that we convene them annually, and then we offer accessibilities on key topics or trending issues so that we are staying on top of accessibility and establishing a base level of professionalism and a base level of accessibility services that are generally being used across the nation and in cultural institutions around the world. So there are two ways to do that training: in-house, which I encourage strongly, and then participating in the global community that we have through the Kennedy Center and through the LEAD conference and our international network. Now, I do want to add something to that. There is nothing, I think it would be really important, and I think it's a really good practice within your country to develop what I might call a countrywide accessibility consortium. What we find in the United States is you have the Kennedy Center, we're operating at a national level. We convene the community once a year. We have ongoing learning opportunities. But in For example, Chicago, they have a cultural access consortium that just convenes the local area theaters and museums. And locally, they have learning experiences and opportunities in order to build the capacity of their local accessibility professionals. And I'm seeing more and more of that happening in the United States at a statewide level. And I'm seeing more and more of that happening at a countrywide level. Because what makes accessibility work in the United States does not always work when you pick it up and plop it down into another culture where you have different cultural expectations and different norms around accessibility and disability. And so creating a cultural consortium at the local level or the countrywide level, I think is a really good approach. First of all, you have a lot of ways to communicate with your audience in advance. Emails and digital communication, online on your website. You can use all of these different strategies to make sure that your audience is informed. The information that we usually provide to our audience is very practical. How do you get here? How do you buy those tickets? How do you get the access services and accommodations that you need? That's what we post on our website. I think this question that you're asking may be more related to when we are offering, for example, a relaxed performance or a sensory-friendly performance, where we want to make sure that before people come, they have an understanding of what to expect. And in those cases, we usually draft what we would call a pre-visit information, which we then post online or email to our audiences in advance. We make that be very practical in order not to spoil the content of the performance. We don't try to tell them everything that's happening. We work with our advisors to identify those things that, for example, if you have sensitivity to loud noises, we might say in the pre-visit information that we provide, during this performance, there are cannons that will be booming on stage. Though that noise usually happens at about 30 minutes into the performance. So what we've done is we've given them information. There's going to be loud noise. It's going to happen at such and such a time. And that's so that we are empowering them to be prepared for and set their expectations for loud noise. But we don't feel that it's necessary. Not at this point. We haven't been advised to do that by our community of people with disabilities, to go into any great depth of detail about the performance. Just giving them a general idea of what to expect during the course of the performance that might act as triggers for some people. And then we usually try to email audience members that have asked to be a part of those performances in advance so that they are prepared and their expectations are set. Absolutely. One of the things we didn't talk about earlier was the fact that people with disabilities come in all shapes and sizes. They have all of us, whether we have a disability or not, have different abilities and different capacities. And we all have developed through our life experiences what works and doesn't work for us. In order to do accessibility really, really well, we need to make sure that we are asking people with disabilities what they find works for them. Their life experiences inform how they interact with the cultural experience. And we need to provide a means and an avenue by which we can have a conversation, an interactive process with people with disabilities that are in our audiences and in our community. Their insights are critical, and we can't and we should not be guessing at what we think someone with a disability needs. We have to ask them what they need. We have to listen to them. We have to have that conversation back and forth so that we have an understanding and we incorporate their insights and their understanding of what they need into the way that we deliver the services. So, for example, when we first started offering sensory-friendly performances, sometimes known as relaxed performances at the Kennedy Center, we invited people to come into the audience and have that experience. And then we surveyed them and we asked them several times, what worked, what did not work for you? Did you like the fact that the house lights were left at half? In other words, they never totally went to blackout. Or did you not like that? Would you like the lights to go completely to dark in the audience? Did having fidgets and little toys to keep you to experience some sort of tactile stimulation during the show, did you need those from us or do you bring your own? Did the ones we provide work or not work? We kept surveying the audience for 3 or 4 different performances, and each time we learned more about what was going to make that type of access accommodation successful, not based on what we presumed or based on our biases or our assumptions, but based on what our audience told us would work. And what we found out, interestingly enough, was the thing that our audiences of people with sensory sensitivities or with autism or neurodivergence, what those individuals really valued about the way we structured our sensory-friendly performances was the fact that when they came in, they felt welcome and they felt like this was a space where that was safe, where they could relax. And what they identified as the things that made them feel safe and welcome was the really well-trained, welcoming, kind audience services people they encountered, like our box office, our security staff, and our ushers. So we learned a lot from that really where we needed to invest our time and effort based on what our audiences told us was on training our staff to be welcoming of all people. And that approach worked really well for us, surveying people, bringing in advisors and consultants throughout the entire process of the development of sensory-friendly performances at the Kennedy Center. Yeah, just, we learned a lot during the pandemic about the importance of connecting in digital space. Look, technology is amazing and technology is constantly changing. And we have to constantly change and adapt those technologies that help us to seamlessly integrate our access and inclusion services into experiences. Online and in digital virtual experiences, these are ways for different kinds of people to experience a lot of different kinds of art. And we need to really think about what those experiences are going to look like when we make them accessible digitally. I would really strongly recommend that as you start to leverage these new technologies and the digital space, that number one, you look at WCAG, WCAG. These are a set of standards that are developed by volunteers from around the world. These are accessibility standards that are applied to digital spaces. How do we make our websites accessible? How do we make this Zoom experience accessible? How do we make our digital accessibility accessible? And those can be found in the WCAG standards that are published online by WC3, the World Wide Web Consortium, WWW, World Wide Web Consortium. And I suggest that you don't do anything in the digital space until your technology people, your IT people have really dug into the WCAG standards to ensure that accessibility is applied in this digital space. examples we can share are when we provided virtual field trips. We live streamed a performance for schools and teachers and children across the United States. And in live streaming that performance, we had to make sure that if it was going into a classroom, that the students with the disabilities in that classroom would also have access. So we created a live stream of the performance. Then we created a live stream of the performance with captioning. Then we created a live stream of the performance with sign language interpreting. Then we created a live stream performance of audio description. Then we created a live stream of the performance with all of those things simultaneous. And when the teacher went into this virtual field trip, they could opt for the accessibility services they needed in their classroom.